Well, thank you so much for having me. So I can get this pulled up here. So, like we discussed, I'm going to be talking about some of the work that we've been doing on um, safer paint strippers, chemical paint stripper substitutes for methylene chloride in collision repair auto body applications. So, just a little bit of background. In the beginning, we had methylene chloride, and it worked super well. Like magic, the paint just seemed to leap off of any surface that it adhered to. What a fantastic product. I mean, here you can see in this image that paint is just like peeling right off of that surface, and doesn't even look like he needs to put any kind of elbow grease into getting that off. It's just all peeling right off, and it could do other things too. In addition to taking paint off of surfaces, it worked well on adhesives, and it even worked to decaffeinate coffee, and that's actually one of the largest uses that it's continued to be put to work as, is to decaffeinate coffee. But there's a problem, and that being that its health effects are serious and well documented. We know a whole lot more now about the harm that can befall those who are exposed to high levels of methylene chloride, and exposure at very high concentrations to vaporized methylene chloride has been responsible for numerous deaths. I think the last statistic was something like 56 deaths since 1986, I believe, have been attributed to exposure to high levels of methylene chloride. The problem being that methylene chloride metabolizes in the bloodstream to form carbon monoxide, and people who are exposed to it essentially suffocate. It also has chronic health impacts, namely that it's a known carcinogen, at least to a number of Western agencies anyway, in the state of California, Prop 65. It's also suspected of causing liver and kidney damage, and that's mostly from animal studies that have been done. So we're going to show a video here, but we're having a little bit of trouble with the technical aspects of it. But I'll just describe briefly. This was a video that was produced by a man's wife. This man, his primary occupation was stripping bathtubs of coatings, and unfortunately, this gentleman ended up passing away one day when he was stripping a bathtub in an apartment complex that had essentially there was no fresh air supply to where he was actually working in. He ended up collapsing in the tub that he was working in and passing away. And his wife produced a video basically on his experience that, he had been working with this chemical for decades, and presumably taking the correct precautions, including, putting on rubber gloves, which, I mean, they're nitrile gloves, and unbeknownst to him, that those didn't actually provide any kind of protection that methylene chloride is. They actually able to penetrate that barrier, and actually penetrate his skin and expose him to the chemical. And so, even, people who are working around this chemical, presumably taking the right precautions, there's still a very significant hazard that they're exposing themselves to that chemical. So if you ever get a chance, I mean, I can if anybody has any questions after this, can send this link out. I'd encourage you to watch it. It's about 7 minutes or so. But this was produced by his wife. It definitely shows the hazard of being exposed to this chemical. So what I've put here is a screenshot of the Data Commons hazard endpoint rankings for methylene chloride. I'll get out of my slideshow really quickly and actually show you. I'll bring it up on the internet. This is what you actually have. So for any of you who have not actually accessed this website before, it ranks chemicals based on a number of what are deemed hazard endpoints. And so if you have any kind of familiarity with like Green Screen, it's a chemical hazard assessment ranking tool. They categorize these chemicals in the same way. They call these hazard endpoints. And so here you have, carcinogenicity, whether or not the chemical is a known or suspected mutagen, if it demonstrates reproductive toxicity, developmental toxicity, endocrine activity, acute mammalian toxicity, systemic toxic, organ effects from single exposure, organ effects for repeated exposure, neurotoxicity, all of these other hazard endpoints here, like skin irritation, eye irritation, acute aquatic toxicity, persistence, whether or not it bioaccumulates, the list goes on, and it will color coordinate and label all of these hazard endpoints based on what the scientific evidence is saying. And so, for instance, for it being a carcinogen, this is ranked. Methylene chloride dichloromethane is ranked as having a high hazard, and there being high confidence for this. And you can look this up on these hazard lists, right? It has all of these different lists where this chemical shows up. Primarily, major, Western chemical hazard list. So what, where is it actually showing up here? And you see all of these different things. You see, Japan screening systems for carcinogens. You see Australia's. You see the U.S. EPA's. And so all of these other ones is California Prop 65. Strong evidence suggesting that it's a carcinogen. And then all these other lists, right, for all of these other different hazard endpoints. So you can look up a variety of different chemicals through this. I mean, I can look up an alternative, one of the ones that we evaluated. So I can look up butyl alcohol. So some of these things, for instance, there's not any kind of evidence to, make a determination on how you'd actually rank these. And when you're evaluating chemicals, like one of our principal goals is to not, substitute what we call a regrettable substitute. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And the lack of data will help to play into that. But anyway, I highly recommend using this tool. It's useful to just get a really quick snapshot of impacts of some of these chemicals. You can also use it to have a lot more extensive evaluation of using some other tools, which I'll get to a little bit later. So consider that. And then regarding methylene chloride, consider that people are exposed to methylene chloride from a variety of different exposure routes. Like I mentioned, the gentleman in that video was exposed primarily, at least what was fatal to him, he was exposed through inhalation. But he was also being exposed through his gloves. And so any kind of chemical that you're working with, you want to be able to consider exposure hazards, how people are actually being exposed to this, knowing the physical properties of a chemical, such as its propensity to vaporize, knowing how exposure to that chemical affects the human body, knowing concentrations that are, generally contained in these types of strippers, knowing the potential failure modes for, people being exposed to this product. Like, how could they be exposed to this? Like a failure being like their PPE was compromised, right? Not having proper ventilation, having other health problems that might be compounded by exposure to the chemical, like for instance, having like asthma or COPD. All of that, because of all of that, we want to ultimately find less hazardous substitutes. So there's a lot of regulations that actually address the use of methylene chloride. For instance, you are probably all familiar with the 6H standard, the NESHAP 6H rules, which pertain to the use of methylene chloride as a paint stripper in coating operations. And so what does that rule say? Well, the rule principally says that, use this chemical only if you can't find a suitable substitute. If you have to use it, minimize the use of it. And use it in ways that reduce volatilization, because methylene chloride is also an ozone precursor chemical. So it's not like a firm and fast rule, like not an outright ban. If you can claim that you can't find an appropriate substitute, and that would be effectively satisfying the rule, but at the risk of spoiling the rest of the presentation, they really wouldn't have any kind of trouble proving that. So so that's the EPA's rule for that. But we also have our own rules. We actually developed a standard industry permit to construct for collision repair facilities due to the large number of those and within the state. So we decided to do this, and significant for our permit to construct, which applies to facilities that spray between 1.25 and 4 gallons of paint per day on average. Significant to them is that our permit actually prohibits the use of methylene chloride in those operations. So that actually is a total ban on that. And so this is a screenshot of what part of the conditions of that permit actually are. So, you know, you might be asking yourself, well, what's the problem then if we ban the use of this chemical? You know, everything should be hunky-dory. Well, perhaps. The challenge is that, you know, those permit conditions were created, and the feedback that we received from these auto body facilities was that, well, they really liked using methylene chloride, and that also that, well, they didn't really know what else they could go to. And that's the problem. So in 2015, we actually embarked on a statewide spray efficiency training blitz that provided the required 6H training, as well as covered issues in our permit to construct. Here you actually see a picture of Ken Grimm from the Pollution Prevention Resource Center in Seattle, who does the painter training, and he provides information on the spray efficiency portion using the Iowa Waste Reduction Center's virtual painter program. If you've never had a chance to use that, I highly suggest you check it out. Painters really liked using it. It was pretty neat. It shows you how thick you actually put on the paint. It'll run down the screen even if you put it on too thick. But anyway, a lot of the feedback that we got in that training centered on the restriction of the use of methylene chloride in our permit to construct. And in no uncertain terms, those shop owners told us that the chemical was their preferred method for specific tasks, and that they really didn't have any alternatives. So, you know, when we're doing this presentation, we had relatively limited information on what potential chemical alternatives could be used that would satisfy their requirements. We gave them a limited information on some case studies that we were able to find that were evaluating some safer alternatives. This included a military study on the removal of CARC, or chemical agent resistant coatings, from tanks and armored vehicles. We also used studies from Dr. Katie Wolf and the Institute for Research and Technical Assistance. The conclusion of this literature review was that some of the alternatives worked, but they didn't really do the job faster or more completely than methylene chloride. And then in general, the best results were with benzyl alcohol, but with some caveats, those being coating type, substrate, dwell time, ambient temperature, and a few others. And because these studies weren't really comprehensive for each of those variables, we wanted to give the shop owners better information so they were more accurately represented with their particular working conditions. So at the time, we also included some information on abrasive non-chemical removal methods, including sandblasting, dry ice blasting, dry soda blasting, wet soda blasting, volcanic rock blasting, walnut shell blasting, and hand removal with grinders and sandpaper. But the feedback that we got from the repair facilities on those methods was not really that supportive. The primary concern being that the damage that they would see to the substrate. They had complained that, at least the guys who had tested the blasting methods anyway, that those removal methods were too hard on some of the softer steels that they were encountering on vehicles that they were working on. And for their customers, that was creating an issue where the paint looked, as far as the paint was applied on the surface, it didn't come out smooth. It kind of came out looking somewhat like bumpier or wavier, and it was not a product that their customers wanted. And so they were all pretty gun shy about looking at blasting and these physical removal methods rather than the chemical ones. So this appeared to be pretty generalized knowledge among the owners and painters that we visited, and it was statewide. It wasn't just concentrated in one area of the state. So we also had some other generalized concerns about the blasting, specifically with dry blasting, because, you know, pulverizing the paint through dry blasting creates other exposure pathways and risks that aren't generally encountered with chemical stripping. So you face the same kind of issues with needing to use proper PPE to protect yourself from the hazards presented by the paint itself. So given the presence of heavy metals in that paint, and especially in older vehicles, you know, we don't want to take that lightly. Wet sanding and blasting can help to minimize the creation of that exposure pathway, but, you know, you create other challenges, which is specifically the disposal of wastewater. And there are questions that need to be asked about where that wastewater is going, whether it's going to a treatment plant, whether there are like pre-treatment restrictions on the content of that wastewater that's going to pre-treatment programs if the plant capable of removing that hazard? What if it's being siphoned directly to a storm drain that has no treatment capability? Also consider if it's being disposed of as solid waste. Would that fluid characterize as hazardous? And if so, that could potentially impact the generator status for, their overall total regulatory burden. So the management of the paint waste is going to be an issue, whether or not it's being stripped with a chemical product or being blasted off or removed through abrasive media. But the chemical stripping is maybe a bit more straightforward as far as exposure to the paint itself. The pathways are more likely to be like ingestion, hand to mouth kind of things, rather than inhalation with blasting or abrasive methods. So because the shop owners expressed resistance to those abrasive methods, and because we didn't really have great information on the chemical alternatives to methylene chloride, we wanted to run some small scale tests for ourselves to find out if we could, at the very least, speak more intelligently about the effectiveness of some of those safer alternatives. So, here's where we're at. We're at, not elimination, we're at substitution. This is the protection hierarchy. So the important caveat here is that we don't want to, if we're evaluating safer alternatives, we don't want to drop in what's called a regrettable substitution. So something that would have effectively the same or worse environmental or human health outcomes as methylene chloride. So for instance, N-methylpyrrolidone based paint strippers have kind of been touted as the heir apparent to methylene chloride. They, have similar performance as methylene chloride in terms of how quickly they're able to remove coatings, the variety of coatings that they're able to remove. The challenge being that a lot of the health issues related to N-methylpyrrolidone are similar, or at least, categorically similar to methylene chloride. And the other thing that we have an issue with is that a lot of the products that have N-methylpyrrolidone as the primary active ingredient are labeled as being environmentally safe. They specifically speak to, like, they'll say, well, it contains no methylene chloride, or they say that it's environmentally safe, but they don't really consider what that means. You don't really, it doesn't really square with terms like, they call it like safe strip, citrus strip, back to nature, soy strip. One of these products contains a blend of NMP and a soy-based ester. So that's a challenge, and the primary, at least known hazard endpoint that NMP is associated with is developmental toxicity, so toxicity damage to reproductive health or the health of unborn children. So when we're looking at those alternatives, I don't want to just sub in something that's as, roughly as bad as methylene chloride. And so, how do we actually do that? How are we picking from all of these different chemicals that are out there? Well, we knew a little bit about the potential effectiveness of a few alternatives from the literature review of our previous efforts. I mentioned benzyl alcohol. We also had heard about dibasic esters and wanted to evaluate them in a way that incorporated those variables that weren't present or weren't comprehensive in the case studies that we looked at. So we were really wondering about how well these things did in temperatures that were below 65 degrees. We wanted to test it on a variety of different coatings, and we wanted to do a better evaluation of potential dwell time. So, and then we also wanted to see if there were more options out there other than those two. We were pretty certain that we wanted to test those two, but we wanted to look for other things. So our thinking was that it was going to be less time intensive if we focused only on selecting those products that were generally deemed effective, and to put those through a full hazard evaluation. And so the idea was that if there was literature out there that showed that the product didn't work, there wasn't really going to be a point in evaluating its hazard, since it would never be chosen by any of these businesses. So the first order of business was to scour literature and see if we could come up with any other replacement options that were strictly based on efficacy. And so for that, we actually turned to the Cleaner Solutions database, and this is compiled by the Toxic Use Reduction Institute at UMass Lowell. If you've never accessed this, can be a really, really handy tool. Our principal purpose in combing through this database was that it provides really detailed information on the efficacy of products for selected purposes. So they actually do like case study trials for clients that have specific needs for like solvents. So it's like, well, we need to remove paint off of this product in this amount of time and with this amount of completeness. And so they have a really comprehensive listing of all of these different case studies. And we were hoping that we were going to be able to find something in there out of all of these case studies that they had testing all of these different solvents for all these different purposes, that we're going to find something that said, well, client that had needed to get paint off of something, you know, using something other than benzyl alcohol, using something other than a dibasic ester product, that hopefully we'd be able to find something. The other thing about this is they actually have their own hazard ranking on here too, you know, so you can kind of generally see, well, you know, was it effective? And then, you know, how hazardous is it compared to like benzyl alcohol or dibasic ester? So if their ranking was like better, then it might, and it was also effective, then that might be something for us to shoot for. So the challenge with this approach was that a lot of those products that are reviewed in this database are evaluated for really niche applications. So while you can search the database to find studies that evaluate solvents for removing paint, those studies don't always provide an adequate match for what we'd find in an auto body application. So as I mentioned previously, some of those applications might involve like full immersion of a part to remove paint. So that's not really something we'd see in an auto body facility. You know, they might involve like not removing all of the paint off of a part, or it's, oh, we're only removing paint off of like a wood substrate, right? So ultimately there was, the scope was too narrow for all of the case studies that we were looking at. Most of the trials failed to meet our criteria, and the reasons were primarily because they were removing a contaminant other than paint. They were removing paint from a substrate other than aluminum or steel. They were removing paint from a method that was other than a manual wipe and scraping. They were tested. The products that were tested were listed as one chemical, but actually contained a blends that included NMP. The products that were evaluated were found to be ineffective. So that actually helped us, remove some things off of our list. The testing indicated that the product would be ineffective due to other factors, such as really long dwell time requirements, or in some cases, the product wasn't even available for sale anymore. So due to all of those things, we kind of ran into a dead end, unfortunately, in the Clean Air Solutions database. So we opted to kind of take some shortcuts and instead select 3 products that were specifically identified for their reduced health hazards. And we would do a more comprehensive health and environmental hazard on those 3 chemicals. And that provided our conclusions that we had reasonable confidence that the chemical was not a regrettable substitution, we would evaluate those for efficacy. So ultimately we settled on 3 products, first being benzyl alcohol, the second being a dibasic ester product that was also combined with dimethyl sulfoxide. And then the third one was an alkaline blend of calcium hydroxide, magnesium hydroxide, and sodium hydroxide. So first and foremost, we wanted to evaluate the known chemical hazards of each of these substances and assign a standardized ranking for each of them. And what we actually ended up doing for this was using the Washington Department of Ecology's quick chemical assessment tool. They have a really comprehensive hazard evaluation tool that allows you to directly compare different classes of chemicals, different chemicals for those hazard endpoints that you saw earlier in the Data Commons website. So if you're not familiar, this chemical assessment tool ranks chemicals based on a grade. So F is the worst, a C is better than an F. And a B is better than a C, and an A is the best class of chemicals. There's no D; it just jumps from F to C. And so this, you actually see on the slide here how you actually grade chemicals. So, for instance, if this chemical fails any of these tests in this F, so if it is if it's highly persistent, if it's highly bioaccumulative, and it's very highly toxic or highly toxic. For all of those different hazard endpoints, it fails that test and gets an F. If it passes all of those tests, then you go on to the letter C categories. And so, for instance, if it has moderate persistence, moderate bioaccumulation, and moderate toxicity. If it fails that test, then it would be categorized as a graded as a C. If it passes all those tests, it go on. You go on for the to the B, and then so on and so forth. So ultimately, that's how you grade the chemical. We chose this one because it was relatively simple. It didn't require a whole lot of extensive research. The fortunate thing about it is that it pulls directly from authoritative lists like Prop 65 or the like the U.S. known carcinogens list, for instance. So the thing about it though is it's just one of only many evaluation tools out there. Others include green screen. We could have done green screens on this. EPA Safer Choice Program is another thing. But the thing is, like, each of these evaluation tools can generate different conclusions for the same chemical. I would say that generally most chemicals would receive an F. That receive an F in the QCAP program would also receive the worst ranking in green screen, and they would also be rejected by the Safer Choice Program. So, when we're really trying to prevent regrettable substitutions, we're not going to pick one that gets an F on QCAT. We wouldn't pick one that gets an F on the green screen. So, but each one of these tools kind of weighs scientific evidence a little bit differently. There's some nuance to these. Green screens, more comprehensive, and especially in that it takes in new information. But for chemicals like methylene chloride, we have actual deaths that tell us that this chemical is bad. But for other things, especially newer things, it's a little bit more of a challenge because we're mostly going on things like animal studies, and sometimes there's data gaps for something, right? Like we don't have enough evidence to make a determination on whether or not this is a known that this would be a carcinogen, or that it presents with developmental toxicity. So that's always a challenge. The other part, and there's another part to that as well. So this is the actual grades that we determined for each of these chemical constituents of the various strippers that we wanted to test, as well as methylene chloride and methylpyrrolidone. You'll see right away that the products that we selected aren't necessarily stellar performers. Every product that we wanted to test was graded as a C in that QCAP program. We couldn't find anything that was a B or below. You'll see that dimethyl sulfoxide was graded as a B, but that was combined with the dibasic ester that was graded as a C. The magnesium hydroxide was combined with the sodium and the calcium hydroxide. So the ones that are the driving ones are the ones with the worst grade. It's if in combined product. So each was ranked equally according to that grading scale, and each was technically better than NMP and methylene chloride. So we're reasonably confident in saying that based on the existing literature, these are preferable to NMP and methylene chloride, but with a few specific caveats, and I'll go over those. So the first one, dimethyl sulfoxide is a carrier agent. We tested one of these products, and some have drawn attention to the fact that in addition to being able to penetrate surface coatings, it'll also carry other chemicals into the body, and so it crosses the skin. And so early use of this chemical actually was interestingly found to produce a garlic taste in your mouth. So if you actually touched it and got it on your hands, it made you taste garlic in your mouth. So when you think about dimethyl sulfoxide being able to carry other agents into your body, that changes how you might think about this chemical. So the best you can do in this situation is proper PPE, and most specifically 18 mil heavy duty rubber gloves. So assuming that PPE is applied correctly, this wouldn't be really much of a problem. But as we mentioned before, people assume that they're using the right PPE when a lot of times they're really not. So that's a big caveat in picking dimethyl sulfoxide anyway. There's other considerations to make about likely exposure routes. So is it likely that I'm going to get exposed to one of these chemicals in a way that would actually provide a pathway for causing any of those specific harms? What's the most likely way that you're going to be exposed to this chemical? Is it inhalation? Is it skin contact? Is it ingestion? All of those things you have to think about. There are other considerations to make about each of the hazard endpoints. So even though each one of these chemicals got a C grade, so it allowed us to compare them directly, that's not because each one of the hazard endpoints had the same ranking. Rather, like if you look at benzyl alcohol, which was shown as having like high neurotoxicity as well as moderate developmental toxicity, other products had moderate developmental toxicity, but also showed evidence of impact in other human health hazard endpoints, like dibasic esters had evidence that showed that their potential, they had the potential to cause endocrine activity. So, you have to think about, well, what is, most important to me? Which of these hazard endpoints am I most concerned about? You have to think about that when selecting a chemical. Again, this is only one evaluation tool. Green Screen might have come to slightly different conclusions about some of these chemicals. The Safer Choice program might have other things to say about these chemicals. The Green specifically because it might have added new literature. And then the other thing is that the data on these chemicals is in constant flux. So as more information is added about a chemical, it may come to be that it ultimately receives a higher or even a much higher hazard than what we know now. So, it's important to not just pick one and stick with it. It's important to, reevaluate these from time to time to make sure that there's nothing new out there that says that, oh, well, this thing is actually a lot worse than we thought. And generally the things tend to go, they don't tend to get better, and they don't tend to get like better rankings after a while. Like things aren't really pulled off of a, Prop 65 list as easily as they're put on there, right? So, very important to consider that. So, the ranking was primarily about establishing a baseline for hazard. It doesn't really say anything about the likelihood of impacts happening, and those are a function of the hazard and exposure. Dose makes the poison, but it helped us to kind of get a shortcut and make a determination that we're not dropping in a regrettable substitute. So anyway, how about we get down to brass tacks? Did these products actually work or not? So first, we tested this product. This is Demon Smart Strip. This is the benzyl alcohol product. It contains benzyl alcohol, a concentration of between 40 and 50%. It was about $20 a quart. Our challenge with this, though, was that we couldn't actually find it locally in any stores. We actually had to pay to have it shipped from Granger, and so that added $10 to the cost. It increased the price by over 50%. So that was a challenge for us. But it was available online. But in our discussions with the body shops, it was pretty abundantly clear that they primarily relied on their suppliers for all of this stuff. So not really totally confident that shopping online for this was going to be their normal way of doing business. But nonetheless, this is what we tried. The product itself is a pretty thick white paste. The application directions state to brush or roll on a layer about a 1/16 of an inch to an 1/8 of an inch thick, and then the dwell time would be between 3 to 24 hours, depending on however many layers of paint you were looking at removing. And then they specifically recommend that the dwell temperatures, the outside temperatures, should be between 50 and 95 degrees, and it's best over 65 degrees. And they didn't recommend using it below 32 degrees. That was just the product statement on there. So the second one that we tried was the Crown Safer Paint Strip, and there's a mixture of dimethyl sulfoxide and dibasic ester. This was $12 a quart, so it was about 25% less than the butyl alcohol, and that's before the shipping costs that we had. We actually purchased this off the shelf at Lowe's. It's a clear viscous liquid. The instructions tell you to pour the product into a metal container and then use a brush to apply. There's no specific indication on dwell times. However, the instructions do say that for multiple layers, the product might need to dwell overnight. Finally, this is our hydroxide alkaline product, PLOA 1. It was $50 for 1.25 gallons, so about $10 a quart. So price-wise, this is actually the most competitive. And we purchased this off the shelf at Sherwin-Williams. We were actually able to talk with one of the store representatives, which was really good. We were hoping that we were going to get some better insight into how well this actually worked, but the store clerk didn't have any information on it, so that was kind of disappointing to us. But the thing about this product is that because it's so alkaline, once the paint is removed, the user will actually need to neutralize the surface with an acid before reapplying a coating. So that becomes kind of a challenge. And part of that was that the product actually comes with the neutralizing agent, which is citric acid. And this was not something that was made apparent when we were researching the chemicals, and not something that we'd considered when we were actually evaluating for chemical hazards. So we had to go back and evaluate the citric acid. And this too was graded as a C. So because it has a really high aquatic life toxicity rating and skin sensitization, eye irritation, and a few other moderate level rankings for human health effects as well. So the kit contains pH strips, so you can test the surface to find out whether or not the acid neutralizes the surface for prep. And then there are a couple other issues with this product. First and foremost being that the product itself comes in a paste, and then the problem was that using a metal scraper made it really difficult to get the paste out of really tight areas. And so since it's really alkaline and I couldn't get the paste out of really tight areas, you know, you can't start reapplying a coating to this because you still have product on the surface that you're trying to remove. The second issue is that we didn't feel that there was enough of the neutralizing agent to work for the entire volume of the stripper. They say that you can use vinegar, but you know, we didn't ultimately have to do that. We didn't run out of the citric acid, but the final issue with this was that the acid actually comes in a powder, so you have to mix it before you apply it, and that concentrated acid was a concern from a potential exposure standpoint. So finally with this, it comes with a paper that you have to put over the surface to keep the product from evaporating too much and drying out. And this kind of made things more messy and time consuming than the other methods. So on a cost comparison basis, this wins out. The Crown is just a little bit more expensive. It's actually about 20% more expensive. And then the last one was the benzyl alcohol, which is about 50% more expensive. The actual testing. These were our test mules. We actually opted to do our test patches on bicycles. So I want to throw a big thank you out to the Boise Bicycle Project, who donated all of these to us free of charge. These were junkers that weren't fixable and weren't going to be sent to the scrapyard, but they had one last hurrah before they were going to be recycled. So we ended up using these 5 bikes: the black Raleigh, this light blue department store bike, the Mount Fury Roadmaster, this green 10-speed, old 10-speed that had an aftermarket custom paint job, this light blue Mongoose, and then this other department store mountain bike. Our actual removal method consisted of starting with the what we ended up doing is, after applying the product, to try and remove the paint with a mildly abrasive removal tool like a greenie, and then on up to a sanding pad, and then finally up to metal, a wire brush, and then metal scraping. So here's our actual results from that testing. And they'll go in the same order, but we'll start and show you the results with all of the testing with the benzyl alcohol product. This was the Smart Strip, the benzyl alcohol, and this is on the light blue Mongoose. Overall, we found that this product performed well. The other good news is that all of this testing was done with outside temperatures below 50 degrees, so it is outside of the optimal range of this product, and we were able to get this performance at dwell times that were less than 2 hours. So you can actually see the full removal of that painted layer all the way down to the substrate. And then all of this was removed with a wire brush. We didn't actually have to move on to a scraper. This was all just done with a wire brush. This was the result for the black Raleigh. The paint was removed completely, the substrate over here. with a wire brush, 2-hour dwell time. Same with this. This is the green home done paint job. This was actually done with a greenie pad only, so like a really, really lightly abrasive pad, but I'll discuss later. This is a misjudgment on our part. I'll get to that really quickly, but this is also 2-hour dwell time. This was a challenge for us. This was the Mount Fury Roadmaster bike. Actually was unsuccessful, even after an overnight 24-hour dwell time and with a metal scraper. So this one, the benzyl alcohol product, did not work on. And this, I apologize for how blurry this is. This is the department store bike, and did get full removal all the way down to the substrate. On to our dimethyl sulfoxide product. This is the Blue Mongoose, all the way down to the substrate. Black Raleigh, this turned out decently well. This is also after a 2-hour dwell time. This is our green bike, and as I mentioned before, with the benzyl alcohol, we were able to remove it just with a greenie. However, we didn't realize this shiny gray layer was actually another coating layer and not the substrate itself. So you actually see the substrate underneath that over here. So this actually penetrated all the way down to the substrate. We didn't try using the scraper with the benzyl alcohol product to actually see if we could get down there until we had to test it again, because we discovered this, right? And ultimately what we found with the benzyl alcohol is that it had trouble penetrating both layers of this paint at the same time. We had to remove the green first at 2 hours and then reapply, and then we were able to remove the next coating. So that, from a performance standpoint, removing multiple layers was a challenge for that the benzyl alcohol product. This was the Mount Fury bike, which the benzyl alcohol failed on, and you can see removal down to the substrate. And this was the department store mountain bike. And overall, I categorize our results with the dimethyl sulfoxide as being superior to the benzyl alcohol, specifically because it removed the paint from the Mount Fury bike that the benzyl alcohol was unable to do. But it did not remove the paint as completely or easily from the yellow mountain bike or the black Raleigh bike, even though we did get substantial removal, enough to satisfy our requirements. It also took a little bit more elbow grease on the same bikes that the benzyl alcohol. It was pretty much just a easy wire brushing. Did have to ultimately go to a scraper with this. So comparable, but generally better than the benzyl alcohol. And this was similar testing conditions. So set times were 2 hours, and then temperatures were approximately 45 degrees. This was the testing results from our hydroxide-based alkaline product. And you can see we were able to penetrate down to the substrate with this, but I will say right now the test required a lot more elbow grease to get that performance. I should also state that all of the results that you'll see pictured from this were at 24-hour dwell times. We were unable to achieve paint removal below that. Here's also a picture of what we actually have to do with this, applying this paper to that product. So this is after 24 hours. Again, after 24 hours, and you can see there's, in some places, it was not even able to remove the first layer of paint. It was really kind of just this patchy look here, but it was able to penetrate to the substrate, but again, only after a full 24 hours. Mount Fury bike was able to accomplish that in 24 hours, unlike the benzyl alcohol. And then here's our department store bike. Not really sure, we weren't sure what all of the coatings were on this, which was part of the challenge, is that since we didn't know what coating types it was, we couldn't, make a direct comparison on, well, it had this performance on this coating type. However, I mean, a body shop's going to take what they get. So we ultimately made the determination that that's not as important for us to make that determination on what the coatings of every single thing is, because, it's going to need to, whatever the product is going to need to work for all of them. So this appeared to have like another layer underneath it, but this product was unfortunately unable to penetrate really at all on this bike. So that was our results for the testing for all three of those products. The last thing that I'll say is that it's kind of early stages. The Toxic Use Reduction Institute at UMass Lowell, which also runs the Cleaner Solutions database, they've actually been working on formulating a chemical paint stripping blend that's a lot closer to the performance of methylene chloride, but which uses less toxic components. And so they just released that report within the last year on their website. This is actually a chart from the blends that they were using, as well as products that they tested against. And so you'll see the supplier, UMass Lowell, listed for all of their different formulations. And they're primarily using dimethyl sulfoxide as a carrier for other solvents, something like methyl acetate, acetone in here. They're really keen on using dimethyl sulfoxide. And then what their results were, just a general summation, is that it actually performed comparably with methylene chloride, outperformed N-methylpyrrolidone in a lot of those tests. And they were following the ASTM standard practice for evaluating the efficiency of chemical removers from organic coatings. So that, that included, they put on, multiple layers, baked it in an oven to simulate aging, and then, ultimately followed up that entire standard for testing these products. So I would characterize their study as being a lot more scientific than ours. However, they also, they didn't test for some of the variables that we were testing for, like specifically like the temperature thing was a big concern for us, because a lot of the shop guys have, open warehouses that in the winter anyway are not really going to be helpful when you have a product that needs to have much warmer temperatures to be able to work and not freeze and bind up. So I'd encourage you to check it out. Their results are very interesting. The challenge being that they want to commercialize this, but it's not something you can buy on the shelf right now. So stay tuned for that. But ultimately, yes, that was our results, and maybe there's going to be some stuff coming out soon. But hopefully that was informative. We're still continuing with this. Ultimately, our hope is to actually test some car parts and sticking only with the benzyl alcohol and the dimethyl sulfoxide dibasic ester product, and then maybe, hopefully in the future too, if they're able to commercialize it, the University of Massachusetts product. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. There's my contact information.